I'm going to talk about artificial intelligence and national security and its role in cyber security from a U.S. perspective. I'm going to tell you a little bit of a couple of little stories, and I promise you I won't keep you too long from lunch. But this conversation this morning reminded me of something that I attended almost 40 years ago at the Pentagon when there was a discussion about the Ballistic Missile Defense Initiative, you know as the Strategic Defense Initiative or Star Wars. And after about 45 minutes of engineers and theoreticians and physicists and defense planners discussing all the different aspects of ballistic missile defense, a very crusty admiral stands up and he says in language I won't repeat here, can someone finally tell me if we can hit the thing or not? Because it was all about trajectories of ballistic missiles and trying to intercept them. And I'm reminded of that often because it told me a couple of things. What is the purpose of the gathering? In this, it's to inform us about artificial intelligence, but it also demonstrates that many people have a very different perspective of a particular technology. So in this case of AI, what does it mean to a student? What does it mean to a doctor? What does it mean to a banker, a financier, a venture capitalist, a C-suite executive at a corporation versus the IT specialist within the company? Or from my perspective, a policymaker? How do I advance policy, or my role actually was to implement and execute policy that my colleagues were developing in the White House. I served on the National Security Council in the Bush administration. I was the senior director for policy implementation and execution. And I often would say policy is about what to do and why. And implementation and execution is finally who's going to do what and how to the policy. So with respect to artificial intelligence, I'd like to continue with a little bit of a story. One I think is familiar to all of us. To me, artificial intelligence is an evolution, a constant evolution of different technologies. In the 1950s, it was all about telecommunications. So if we were back here in the 1950s, we'd be talking about how to secure telecommunications. In the Eisenhower administration in Washington, it was recognized that to secure telecommunications was fundamental to the national security of the United States, particularly in an era of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. We flash forward to the 1980s. Oh, by the way, in the 50s, and the woman that spoke earlier this morning by a message was absolutely right. Artificial intelligence, the beginnings of machine learning, occurred in the 50s after the advent of computers that were used in World War II started to compute data that was presented in very, what we would say, archaic form to model certain activities. So we started to see certainly the importance of telecommunications in the 50s and the very beginnings of machine learning. By the 1980s, we see something called convergence. That's when telecommunications start to marry with something called automated information systems. We now know them as computers. And what that meant was we were moving information on a telecommunications network, and at the endpoints, computers were processing that information. We have things called what? These are cell phones. Phones. Well, no, they're not. They're computers. All right. We purchase these from a phone company. All right. Often in the United States, it could be AT&T or T-Mobile, or here it may be Huawei or British Telecom or Deutsche Telekom or Alcatel. But telecommunications companies, telephone companies, sell these systems that we call phones. And oh, by the way, they're called mobile phones. And for many of us, if you see the signature in someone's email, it's my mobile number is. Where did it become mobile? Well, back in the late 70s or early 80s, Verizon demonstrated that you could have a continuous conversation in a car moving down the coast of California without a breakup in connectivity. It was like a big brick or walkie-talkie of World War II. So you could have a mobile conversation. Well, now we've got computers, and someone earlier said there's more computational power here than there was in the lunar landing that landed men on the moon in 1968. So we've evolved a lot. By the 2000s, the coin of the realm was recognized, and that's data. Data is what moves across telecommunications networks and is processed at the endpoints. You have a data plan with your phone, right? That you purchase, and whether or not it's a phone system or a phone contract that can carry a lot of data, and the fidelity of the data, and the latest generation of iPhone, if it's the iPhone, what is now 16, I think this is a 13, it's really hard to keep up with the technology. But really, artificial intelligence or the cyber domain is the convergence of telecommunications, computers, and data. Now, where's the competition today? From a national security perspective, it's in all three of those factors. Telecommunications. Most countries now are evolving to 5G, the fifth generation of telecommunications, but there are already plans for 6G. There are theoretical papers written about 7G. What's that going to mean? Well, in simple terms, going back to my 40-year-old story, we're going to be able to move ever more volume amount of data with greater fidelity faster through this, let's call it a pipeline, all right? So there's the advances of telecommunications that we have to consider. Secondly, we have to consider the evolution and advancement in computer systems. The cornerstone of a computer system is a chip, and you probably are very well aware that there's competition around the world for the leaders of chip manufacturing. It's why Taiwan is so important to the United States, because most of our chips come from Taiwan that go into every system we can think of: our phones, our refrigerators, our cars, all of our computers that we depend upon. And the third arena of competition is data. The exfiltration of data, different countries, different organizations, whether they're criminal organizations, realize that the value is in data. The more data I have, the more data I can flow through a telecommunications architecture, the more data I can process through my computers, I become more aware. Artificial intelligence becomes more effective for us. And from the United States perspective, there is competition for us to secure our telecommunications network, our data, and our computer systems, our ability to process and manufacture computer systems. It's why we are in competition with Huawei, why we are in competition with chip manufacturing, why we are in competition with the protection of data. We've had many examples of data theft. I was a victim, as 22 million of my other American colleagues, when the OPM, Office of Personnel Management at the White House, was breached. What is OPM? It is the Human Resources Department of the federal government. It stores all the data that we've now digitized of people's backgrounds, where they come from, their families, their social security number, their banking number, their psychological profile if they have one, their fingerprints has all been digitized because of the efficiency of electronically storing this material. But it became very valuable data for the Chinese. So when they penetrated OPM, they copied all the data. Fortunately, they didn't distort or destroy the data, but now they have the files, all the data of 22 million Americans, many of us who hold clearances, and they can, with their advances in artificial intelligence, extract from that data very valuable information for their government. We are aware, I'm sure, of the intellectual property that many companies have lost, have been exfiltrated. The loss of research and development funds and times during COVID. Fortunately, in the United States, we were protecting Pfizer and Moderna, who manufactured the vaccines for COVID, but we certainly saw the Russians and the Chinese and others trying to steal the research data because they wanted to circumvent the effort that we had and create their own vaccine. So from a national security perspective, it's very important that we take into account the security of telecommunications, the security of our data, and the security of our ability to manufacture computers and be at the cutting edge. And it's a race. I want to talk about what does AI do for us, or do in general. We collect data, we store data, we analyze data, we process data, we learn from this data, and then we can act based upon what we've learned from this data and the ability to understand the data. This reminds me of something called the OODA loop. It was a concept created by or conceived by a former U.S. Air Force pilot who felt that if I can orient myself, observe my environment, orient myself within that environment, make decisions, and act upon those decisions faster than my adversary, I will generally win in a dogfight in the sky. And if you take that concept to artificial intelligence, if we can observe more of the world around us, orient ourselves within that environment in a way that we can exploit for our purposes, make decisions or evaluate the multiple decisions before us, make a decision, and then act upon it, we are going to improve the quality of our life, or a company is going to be more effective, or a government is going to be more secure. So the OODA loop concept to me is very, very important. Now, in the big picture, to me, artificial intelligence works at two different levels. It can assess better than a human being patterns and draw inferences from patterns. So a doctor can look at much more data through artificial intelligence and diagnose a disease or an ailment of an individual and even prescribe a treatment. Or a lawyer or his legal aides can look through a multitude of legal case history to make a more compelling argument in court. Or a student can research ever more material out there and streamline their research effort to write the paper that's going to get them an A in class. So from a pattern perspective, artificial intelligence helps us tremendously. But on the other hand, I also think it's very valuable at the micro level, where we can micro-target. Most of us have been on Amazon. We've purchased on Amazon, and we then get suggestions about what to purchase next on Amazon because they are storing our data. They're understanding our preferences, and they say, oh, John likes all these books. Hey, here's another recommendation of a book you might not know about that you might want to purchase, or we noticed you like white shirts. Here's another manufacturer of white shirts. We know you don't like blue, so we're not going to give you a suggestion to buy blue shirts. And that material, that information is very valuable to marketeers. This does call into a question, who owns the data that we produce? We produce ever more individually amounts of data, but who owns it? For ease of purchase, I've given Amazon my preferences. I give them my banking numbers. So when I purchase something, I don't have to send them a check. I don't even know if people even use checks anymore or cash. You know, when's the last time you received cash in your bi-monthly or your monthly paycheck? I mean, you don't. You get money wired, and you assume it goes from your employer to your bank, and then you draw, or Amazon will draw money from that bank to purchase whatever it is you want, and then you receive it, you know, in a day or so, with no contact with money. So it facilitates our lives, but there are certainly a lot of inherent challenges. So at the micro-targeting level, from a national security perspective, we now see that there's the technology out there, AI-enabled, can detect through facial recognition or biometrics your individual faces, and that information can be sent to something that we would call a lethal autonomous weapon system, a drone that could hover over us and find out, well, which face among us is the one that we want to target, that we've programmed, and it will target you. Or we're seeing bioengineering that is focusing on individuals' DNA. So no surprise that some firms, some countries are very interested in the DNA research that goes through 23andMe or the other commercial corporations that take your DNA, you take a swab and you want to find out your ancestry. Well, that information goes somewhere for someone to interpret, and that data is stored to find out that I come from Europe, my ancestors come from Europe, and that information can be used for nefarious purposes, for sure. we in the United States are definitely in competition, in AI competition with the Chinese and the Russians. I think that's pretty obvious for different reasons. The Chinese are very competitive with us in telecommunications, in computers, in chip manufacturing, and certainly in data. And they've said they want to be the world's leader in artificial intelligence because they do recognize it's an extremely powerful capability to have. The Russians certainly are increasingly capable in artificial intelligence. We see a lot of their advances in robotics, which we are certainly engaged with. And I want to just point out a couple of examples of things that people have talked about here this afternoon: disinformation, deep fakes, and the ability to distinguish among them. There was a very, and you may know this better than I, but several years ago in Ukraine, a message which was sent out to people in a particular city in Ukraine, and it had the logo of their emergency medical service. The message was in a dialect that most Ukrainians would understand as their own. And the messaging was very clear. You're about to be surrounded by the Russians. Here are the evacuation routes. Please go forthwith and leave the city. Well, the Ukrainian government realized that this was a deepfake message, and they had to send out a rebuttal, but they had to use the same logo because it was their logo for emergency services. They obviously speak and write and sent the message out in Ukrainian, and they were telling people, don't leave the city, don't take these emergency routes, the Russians aren't coming. Now, if you're an Ukrainian, you have probably, you're in a conundrum at this point. Which message do I believe? Do I leave or do I stay? All right, and that capability is only improving. We've seen that in our elections in 2016, in 2020, in the recent elections in 2024. The ability to hijack social media. Most individuals today use social media to get their information, all right? They're not reading a newspaper front to cover or watching television 24/7. They might see a clip, but I hear on my phone a feed of different sources of news, and I'll scroll through it, and I might find an interesting article that I'll look at in brief. I'm not going to read the whole thing because I don't have a lot of time, like as most of us don't. And the ability to then hijack that and feed me false information is increasingly a challenge. And I need the ability to distinguish fact from fiction, and it's becoming harder. If you ever work with younger people who are accustomed to this from birth, it's very difficult sometimes to remove them from this and tell them, look, you need to be a little bit more critically thinking and not just take everything for granted. What we are seeing right now in the United States is a major Russian disinformation effort post-election to stir up questions about the election to the extent that people are concerned, or the policies that might be proposed by a new Trump administration. So it's not just before the election, but after, and it's all about deep fakes and the ability to create such realistic images and messages that extend or stress our ability to distinguish among them. What do we do about it? Well, historically, research and development in the United States was led by the government. Nuclear science, GPS, someone mentioned before, the internet, which was originally from ARPANET, an Army research program to connect computer systems. That came from the government. But today, artificial intelligence, telecommunications, computers, data, it's from companies. It's from Amazon, it's from Google, it's from Microsoft, many others. So government now depends on the private sector much more than it has in the past if it wants to be at the cutting edge of artificial intelligence technologies. And what do we do about it? Well, we have organizations called DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, which is almost like government venture capital to look at cutting edge technologies in the private sector that we, the government, may want to adopt, to purchase into, or to further contribute funding. There's an Intelligence Advanced Research Project Agency that the U.S. intelligence community taps into the private sector. You may have heard of Palantir. Palantir being now a very a public company that did a lot of data mining and link analysis that helped the CIA after 9/11 find out all the connectivity about different suspected terrorists around the world. Who are they communicating with? How frequently were they communicating? Palantir, and I'm not going to give you all the details about them, but were very, very effective. We have something called the Defense Innovation Unit Experimental. So when the Pentagon recognized that there is a lot of cutting edge work in Silicon Valley in the United States, and we need to partner with them and understand what are they doing that we might want to adopt. Can we work with them? Appealing to their patriotism, appealing to their financial interests, we found it to be a very, very effective entity. We also have something called the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center for the U.S. military, trying to figure out how can we embrace this evolving series of technologies. It's not one technology, but how can we optimize the benefits for their purposes of artificial intelligence? From a purely domestic sector perspective, we are investing in microelectronics, chip manufacturing, realize that we have vulnerabilities internationally with a global supply chain, and we want to be more independent. Not completely, but we have to be careful that we are not so dependent upon the critically important chips that go into all these systems that we don't have some positive control over. Several of you spoke earlier about a trained and important workforce. I'm probably not of that crowd. I think my daughters would say I'm a technical Neanderthal, but how can we embrace a younger generation that is much more savvy and sophisticated to help us understand the implications? And then we need efforts to the private sector and the public sector working together to better secure the heavy investments of research and development that lead to intellectual property that is really the value of a corporation. I was thinking earlier, if a CEO of a company were here, they may or may not be interested in AI. They're interested in their bottom line and what gives them the bottom line. What is the product or service that is critical to the company that will make them profitable, and how might they lose that edge? If you are Coca-Cola, you want to preserve the formula for Coke, or Kentucky Fried Chicken, the secret sauce that makes Colonel Sanders' chicken so tasty, or Lockheed Martin and the F-35 aircraft. So government and industry are finding new and better ways to secure intellectual property. And finally, when I was involved, it was about the laws and regulations, the policies, the executive orders, and they will always lag behind technology. There is no government on earth that can predict the evolution of technology and the impact of technology to the point that we can have cutting edge legislation. As I mentioned, the mobile phone, even the creators of that technology never foresaw that they would turn into something like this. So my points, thank you very much. I hope I haven't kept you too long from lunch. Good luck to all of you.
Fascinating. Thank you.